The course of true love never did run smooth. That's what Lysander tells Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I think that line is an appropriate description of so many of Shakespeare's comedies. But the topic here is A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is a play relatively early, from the mid 1590s, and we'll talk a little bit, just briefly, about its publication history. Here is an image of the first quarto of the play, which was published by Thomas Fisher in 1600. Thomas Fisher was relatively new to the publishing industry. This is one of the very first things that he published, and he apparently was not very successful. He didn't publish much more after this. He didn't publish any other quartos by Shakespeare, and he did publish some other plays, but apparently couldn't make a good living at it. We don't see a lot of other material published by Thomas Fisher. He was clearly, I think, trying to start his publishing business by capitalizing on a well-known play, a well-known playwright. He says on the title page that A Midsummer Night's Dream has been sundry times publicly acted, a clear appeal to prospective purchasers. It was an older play by 1600, and was trying to renew some interest in it, because scholars generally accept that the original performance date for A Midsummer Night's Dream is around 1595 or 96. He also mentions Shakespeare's theater company here, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and also William Shakespeare, whose name was appearing with some regularity on quartos by this point, and had been since 1598. So I want to talk about three things in a very general way before getting into talking about specific scenes in the play. I want to talk about bricolage. This is a term for just a word to describe an assemblage of disparate, diverse materials to create something new. I'm also going to talk about rhyme and prose for a few minutes, and then talk about meta theater. So we'll start with bricolage and what makes A Midsummer Night's Dream an example of it. It's one of Shakespeare's shortest plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream, that is. From a dramatic standpoint, one could argue that it is longer than it really needs to be, and I'm not going to talk about that here. I'll talk about that a little later when I get into a synopsis of the play. But the brevity of the play amplifies the diversity of Shakespeare's source materials and the variety of performance modes that he employs. We find material drawn from Greco-Roman literature and history woven together with English folklore traditions. Oberon and Titania are nominally fairies, but in their marital discord, they resemble more the gods of Olympus. I'm thinking in particular of Jupiter and his wife Juno. They never get along. So in their marital discord, they resemble more the Greco-Roman gods than the diminutive, energetic beings with names like Cobweb and Peace Blossom, who zip and titter around them in the play. For a classically trained reader, it must have seemed a really odd, unsettling mixture of material. And the play was poorly regarded by many Enlightenment critics and rarely staged until the 19th century, the Romantic period with the interest in dreams and imagination. As for the modalities of performance, the scenes set in Athens are grounded in kind of mundane, everyday reality. Even the revels in Act 5 are constrained by the Duke's mitigating authority and the aristocrats' constant commentary on the performance of the Mechanicals play. But Acts 2 and 3 and most of Act 4 take place in the woods outside Athens. And this is a dreamy world subject to fairy magic rather than Athenian law. And the fairies, in addition to these two very different worlds, the fairies and rude mechanicals introduce elements of music and dance that had much in common with the court masks and pageant shows of the Elizabethan period. So that's what I mean when I talk about the play as one of Shakespeare's best examples of bricolage. Rhyme and prose. Talk about next. You might have noticed there's a lot of rhyme in this play. A Midsummer Night's Dream belongs to a small group of early plays that contain a substantial number of rhymed lines. Midsummer contains 1,544 verse lines, and 52% of them are rhymed. This is unusual in Shakespeare's canon. We associate Shakespeare more with blank verse or unrhymed iambic pentameter. Only Love's Labour's Lost contains more rhymed lines, 66%, but that play also contains a greater proportion of prose, 32% prose to Midsummer's 20%. The other plays in this group are The Comedy of Errors, King Richard II, and Romeo and Juliet, with which A Midsummer Night's Dream bears some resemblance. Together, these plays are sometimes called Shakespeare's lyrical plays. That you'll see that phrase sometimes used to describe the plays that I just listed there. As is often the case in Shakespeare's plays, prose speech is a marker of social class. So lower class characters, such as servants, clowns, artisans, generally speak in prose, while verse speech is generally reserved for aristocratic upper class characters. One of the curious aspects of this pattern in A Midsummer Night's Dream is that it's reversed during the interlude, or the performance of the play Pyramus and Thisbe in Act 5, where the mechanicals deliver their lines, or they try to very clumsily deliver lines in rhymed verse, while Theseus, Hippolyta, and the others comment on the performance in prose. Metatheater. So another crucial element of the play is the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe in Act 5. It's a play within the play, a kind of what I like to call telescoping theater, in which we watch characters on stage who are themselves watching and remarking on a play. So we have performed on stage a fiction of fiction making. And Shakespeare does this elsewhere as well. There's the performance of the Nine Worthies in Love's Labour's Lost, and the famous mousetrap scene in Hamlet. But the mechanicals in Midsummer seem, to me anyway, much closer to the theater companies with which Shakespeare himself was involved. The mechanicals, the artisans performing the play, they may be amateurs. Puck calls them hemp and homespuns in Act 3, Scene 1, line 65. And they have a severe deficit of dramatic sense. They miss their cues. They bungle their lines. At the same time, though, Peter Quince, the sort of the leader of the troupe, is familiar with some of the technical vocabulary of early modern theater. For instance, he seems comfortable using terms like tiring house in Act 3, Scene 1, line 4, and the term cues. And Nick Bottom understands the function of prologues and epilogues. And in a really funny moment, he gives practical advice to his fellow actors about what they should avoid eating before going on stage. He says, "Hey guys, stay away from the onions and the garlic, or we're going to be miserable um, talking talking to each other up there." So that's what I mean by meta theater, sort of theater about theater. So before I get into a synopsis of the play, which will be helpful for setting up our analysis of specific scenes, I think it's always helpful to identify at least the characters that I'm going to spend the most time talking about in this video. Basically, at first, I'm going to focus on the four main couples. Three of those couples are Athenians, and then one couple from the fairy world. But we'll have to start with Theseus, who's the Duke of Athens, the voice of authority in the play, and his wife Hippolyta. Hippolyta is an interesting character. She's a war trophy. It's important to understand that. We learn it in the first 20 or so lines of the play, that she was queen of the Amazons, and that they were defeated in battle by Theseus, and that he has basically taken Hippolyta as his own. And I saw a performance online, I think it's a Globe Theater performance, where before the opening scene even begins, the actors come on stage and mime a battle between the Athenians and the Amazons, and in that battle, Hippolyta is defeated, and then the play actually begins as written. But Hippolyta is, I think she represents something important in the play. She's a subtle example of the patriarchal violence that mobilizes the play's action, and not just in the human world of Athens, but also in the fairy world of the woods beyond its walls. There's the very, very patriarchal figure of Hermia's father, domineering father Aegeus, and then of course Oberon in his relationship with Titania. But back to Hippolyta. Another interesting aspect of this is that, according to the mythological tradition on which Shakespeare drew for the material for this play, the marriage of Theseus and Hippolyta did not end the way the fairies anticipate at the conclusion of the play. The Amazons were unhappy about their queen being captured and married to Theseus, and declared war on Athens, and this resulted in the Attic War, and that Hippolyta was eventually slain. So it is not a comedic ending to the story of Theseus and Hippolyta. The parallel couple in the fairy world is Oberon and Titania. Oberon, this is a name that Shakespeare pulled from a popular French romance, a chanson de geste that had been translated into English, and he may have seen a stage adaptation of that romance in the early 1590s, but no copy of that play has survived, and that's purely speculative. But that idea has been floated as well. There are two other couples to mention here, Hermia and Lysander. They're kind of the main romantic focus of the play. And then there's Helena and Demetrius. And Helena, for me, is the most complicated and compelling and interesting character in the play. She is rejected by Demetrius. She's abandoned by her childhood friend Hermia for Lysander. And she's Hermia's rival for the affections of Demetrius in adulthood. So Helena experiences, I think, the most intense emotional lurches in the play. She longs at one point to become somebody else. She fantasizes about transformation, which of course human reality denies to her. But at the same time, we see Nick Bottom, who's an actor, who's someone who changes identities in theatrical performance, who's literally transformed by fairy magic into this grotesque, ass-headed man. So all of these characters, with the exception of Oberon and Titania, are Athenian characters. I'm going to add to this list Aegeus, who's the most explicit expression or incarnation, I guess, of patriarchal authority in the play. There are many, many stern, misguided fathers like him in Shakespeare's work, and filial duty, the obligation of a child to his or her father or parents, is a recurrent motif in Shakespeare. And one of the sort of curious things about the character of Aegeus is he introduces this big problem into the play, which could end with the execution of his daughter, and then very abruptly in Act 4 he disappears. We'll take a closer look at that moment a little later in this video. There's another fairy I want to mention. So these are the Athenian characters, and there's another fairy, Robin Goodfellow. I like to call him Puck. He's sometimes, his speech prefix is sometimes listed as Puck, and this is part of the fairy group in the play. Puck is a character whose early prototype is sort of a stock slave character that appears frequently in the Roman comedies of Plautus and Terence. These are dramatists that Shakespeare would have been reading in grammar school. These characters make mischief, comical mischief, they interfere with romantic relationships, but they also play a kind of matchmaking role and untangle those relationships by the end of the play. Puck is a unique supernatural character in Shakespeare. I think the closest analog I can think of is probably Ariel in The Tempest, which is one of Shakespeare's last plays and one that we'll be reading later in the semester. I would be remiss, of course, not to mention at least some of the mechanicals. That's what Puck calls them, mockingly at one point. Rude mechanicals, he calls them. Bottom is the one, Nick Bottom, he's probably the most important from a dramatic point of view because he's transformed and he's part of Oberon's retaliation against his wife, Titania. But the real leader of the group is Peter Quince, who's literate. He knows how to write, and he takes charge of the production of Pyramus and Thisbe. So, having discussed the characters and the main characters we'll be talking about, I left some out, obviously. But those are the main ones who will be coming up. But before we get into any kind of discussion of specific scenes, I always think it's good to have a synopsis of the play and to spend a little time on it, just so that we're all familiar with what happens, the big events. And I may leave a few things out. I'm sure that I do. But I try to get all the big events just to make sure that we have a cohesive sense of the narrative before getting into specific scene analysis. The play was not published with act or scene breaks until the 1623 folio. The two quartos, the 1600 and 1622 quarto editions, had no act or scene breaks at all. And then in the 1623 folio, act breaks were introduced, and then the scene breakage came a little later. I don't know the history of that, but what's important to know is that when Shakespeare wrote the play, apparently he did not bother with scene breakage. So we'll start with Act 1, which is in 2 scenes. In fact, the first 4 acts are all 2 scenes apiece. But the play begins with Theseus, the Duke of Athens, who's preparing for his marriage to Hippolyta, the Queen of the Amazons. And he wants this to be a festive occasion. He talks to Philostrate, let's make this a good time. But Aegeus arrives very quickly and puts a damper on things. He's angry. He's seeking the Duke's aid in compelling his daughter, Hermia, to accept his choice for her husband, which is Demetrius, even though Hermia is in love with another man, Lysander. Theseus agrees with Aegeus and advises Hermia to comply with her father's wishes or face swift and very severe punishment. In fact, she could be executed for disobeying her father. So after this really tense situation, Lysander and Hermia are alone together, and they decide that the only option left to them is to elope, and they plan to meet in the woods outside Athens later. And I think go to Lysander's aunt's house, wherever that is, off in the hills somewhere. Meanwhile, Hermia's friend Helena, she's in love with Demetrius. But now that Demetrius is in love with Hermia, obviously Helena feels rejected and a little betrayed by her friend, and she envies Hermia's beauty and charm, whatever it is that I don't have that she has, that has attracted the man that whom I love. Hermia and Lysander reassure her that once they are married, because they share their plan with her, Demetrius is going to fall back on her. But Helena has other ideas, and after they leave, she decides to tell Demetrius of Lysander and Hermia's elopement, hoping that this will cause him to look more favorably on her. And while this drama is unfolding, a group of artisans, sort of clownish, they're goofy. They begin working on a play to celebrate the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. Peter Quince, like I said before, he takes charge and assigns the parts, and they agree that to avoid any unwanted attention, they want to keep their performance, they want to keep it secret. They decide that they'll rehearse at night in the same woods where Lysander and Hermia planned to meet on their way out of town. So Act 2 picks up on this. We now get introduced. We're now in the woods, and we remain there until near the very end of Act 4. At this point, the hobgoblin Puck, Robin Goodfellow, comes on stage and announces that there's a problem in fairyland, that Oberon, the king of the fairies, and his wife Titania had been quarreling, a really sort of bizarre dispute over an Indian boy who's been abducted, and that they refuse to reconcile. They also accuse each other of dallying with someone else, which of course they both deny doing. But this strife, this marital strife, has made life difficult for the Athenians, causing inclement weather, crop wastage, and disease. Strangely, everyone inside the Duke's palace seems oblivious to all this going on in the country around. But back to Oberon, in retaliation against Titania, he orders Puck to find this flower that produces this love juice that, once it's applied to Titania's eyes while she's sleeping, will cause her to fall in love with whomever she sees when she wakes up. At this point, then, Demetrius and Helena enter the woods, and they're looking for Lysander and Hermia. But Demetrius is irritated by Helena's presence, and he accuses her of harassing and stalking him. And she says, "It's not my fault. I'm in love with you. Treat me poorly, but just pay attention to me." And we'll take a look at that disturbing moment a little later. But Oberon overhears this dispute between the two, and he takes pity on Helena. And so when Puck returns with the juice, he says, well, we got a little change of plans here. I want you to anoint Demetrius's eyes and arrange for him to see Helena when he awakens. And I'm going to go ahead and go off and and do the same to Titania. Meanwhile, Lysander and Hermia are also wandering around in the woods, and they find themselves lost, and they get tired and they lie down to sleep, which is unfortunate because they're discovered by Puck, who, because Hermia wanted to sleep apart from Lysander, mistakes Lysander for Demetrius and anoints his eyes with the love juice. The problem now is that Helena has fallen behind Demetrius. Demetrius has successfully ditched her, and so she stumbles upon Lysander, who awakens, and now he falls immediately in love with her. She interprets Lysander's advances as a joke, that he's just mocking her, and she leaves angrily, not understanding that Lysander is affected by this fairy magic. And now he is absolutely disgusted, revolted by the sight of Hermia, and he just leaves her. He just leaves her sleeping in the woods. So in Act 3, also two scenes, the mechanicals now get involved. They show up in the woods outside Athens to rehearse their play Pyramus and Thisbe. Puck discovers them. He watches their rehearsal and he thinks it's just absolutely ridiculous. He makes fun of their blundering amateur performance, and as a joke, he transforms Nick Bottom, who plays the role of Pyramus, the main role, into an ass, or at least he changes his head into the head of an ass, which freaks out everyone else, and they all scatter through the woods, and now Bottom finds himself alone, and he sings nervously to himself and ends up waking up Titania, who, of course, because she's been drugged by Oberon, sees Bottom and immediately falls in love and appoints an entourage of fairies to wait on him. Puck reports back to Oberon that he had done his duty, but when they overhear Hermia, who comes on stage distraught that Lysander has disappeared, he's wandered off, but she thinks that maybe Demetrius is guilty of foul play because she finds him and accuses him of murder. Oberon now realizes the mistake, that Puck drugged the wrong man, and he mistook Lysander for Demetrius. Demetrius is absolutely exasperated. He's been hounded literally by Helena, and now Hermia is all over him and accusing him of murdering someone. He gets tired, says, I just need to sleep. I'm just going to go to sleep. So he goes to sleep. Oberon, hoping to make things right, applies the love juice to Demetrius's eyes while Puck is off trying to get Helena. And Demetrius awakens. He falls in love with Helena exactly as Oberon planned, but now there's a problem because there are two men in love with Helena, Lysander and Demetrius. Helena believes that this is all part of some elaborate prank to make fun of her. She's understandably upset. And then Hermia arrives. She's no less confused and hurt by Lysander's strange behavior, but Helena believes that she must be involved in the prank too, and the two friends now turn on each other. So in Act 4, all this is going to get resolved. As Titania and Bottom lie sleeping, Oberon informs Puck that because of Titania's infatuation with Bottom, she has agreed to relinquish the Indian boy to him. So having achieved now his objective, he directs Puck to restore Bottom to his fully human self. Oberon and Titania quickly reconcile and dance, and they agree to visit the Duke's palace and bless the wedding. At daybreak, Theseus, Hippolyta, and Aegeus are now in the woods for the first time under really bizarre pretext, and they discover the young lovers asleep in the woods. Um, they wake up and they seem sort of hungover from all the fairy juice that's been they've been drugged, right? So Aegeus is livid when the sleep-addled Lysander admits that, yeah, we were Hermia and I, we were trying to elope. But this is an interesting moment in the play because Aegeus's fatherly rage is basically rendered moot by Demetrius, who now admits not only that he doesn't want to marry Hermia, he doesn't love her anymore, but that he had, in fact, earlier promised himself to Helena, which Theseus, at the very beginning of the play, had kind of thought maybe was the case as well. So Theseus extends his blessing to both the young couples now, announcing that they're all going to be married together. She's going to have a big group wedding in Athens, and then Aegeus just disappears. He's just gone from the play at this point. Meanwhile, returned now to his human form, Bottom finds himself alone and confused in the woods. He makes his way back to Athens and is finally reunited with his fellow actors just in time to perform Pyramus and Thisbe before the wedding celebrants, which is pretty much what the final act, Act 5, is all about. There is a lot of interesting material in Act 5, which I want to talk about. But by the end of Act 4, all the play's principal conflicts have been resolved. Oberon and Titania are reconciled quite easily and breezily. Lysander and Hermia are to be married. Demetrius has accepted Helena as his legitimate bride, although this is under the influence of fairy magic, and Bottom is reunited with his companions. Act 5 begins with Theseus and Hippolyta weighing the truthfulness of what they've been told about the mysterious events of the preceding night. And that's a really interesting conversation that I want to take a close look at. Theseus summons Philostrate, it's like his master of the revels, to finalize the entertainment for the wedding celebration, and eventually settles on the play Pyramus and Thisbe. Surprise, surprise, right? The Mechanical's very incompetent performance of this play is so naively farcical in execution that it is at once charming and hilarious, not only for the Duke and his household, but even for the audience watching all of this unfold on stage. After the Duke's household retire to their chambers for the night, the fairies appear and bless all of the newlyweds, and that's basically how the play ends. With a short epilogue from Puck at the very end of the play. So what I'd like to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about some specific scenes, and I often try to organize these thematically. I want to talk about several scenes. I try to limit it to about 8 or 10 critical, pivotal, or interesting scenes. And I'm going to start by talking, this first group, this first batch will be focused primarily on the theme of love and desire. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most important of these scenes, which is the very beginning of the play, scene 1, lines 22 to 105, which is the scene that basically sets up the crisis of the play, that Hermia has been given a kind of deadline to make a decision about what she's going to do. Is she going to accept death or incarceration in a monastery, or is she going to accept her father's choice of a husband for her? So there's a lot of discussion in these lines about marriage and love and filial duty. Aegeus, of course, or Aegeus is angry that his daughter Hermia refuses to marry his choice, which we know is Demetrius. And as I already said, Theseus, the Duke, supports Aegeus, and he tells Hermia that you are but as a form in wax by him imprinted, and within his power to leave the figure or disfigure it. So basically, his father made you, he can unmake you, you need to comply with his wishes. Hermia's position is that the marriage that marriage is a matter of love, not of duty. And she says, so will I grow, so live, so die, my lord, ere I will yield my virgin patent up unto his lordship, that lordship meaning Demetrius, whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give sovereignty. Lysander also speaks in this scene. I really love his first lines. He's a total smart mouth. But for his part, he defends himself as a suitable match for Hermia, and no one disputes that. Nobody disputes that they're not that he's inappropriate for her, which makes Aegeus's choice of Demetrius seem even more arbitrary and tyrannical. So after the adults exit the stage, Lysander and Hermia are alone, and they talk about love. This is primarily lines 128 to 155. This is the scene where Lysander says, "The course of true love never did run smooth." And there are some really excellent lines in here about all the ways that young couples find themselves crossed in love. Lysander says, if there is sympathy in choice, that is, if two people actually do love each other, there are so many things working against them. If there is sympathy in choice, war, death, or sickness did lay siege to it, making it momentary as a sound, swift as a shadow, short as any dream, brief as the lightning in the collied night that in a spleen unfolds both heaven and earth. And ere a man hath power to say, behold, the jaws of darkness do devour it up. So quick, right things come to confusion, he says. And Hermia agrees. She's like, yeah, that seems to be the way the world works, right? And we just have to accept that and be patient. That's her position. She says, if then true lovers have been ever crossed, it stands as an edict in destiny. Then let us teach our trial patience, because it is a customary cross, as due to love as thoughts and dreams and sighs, wishes and tears, poor fancy's followers. And Lysander says, a good persuasion. Yes, I absolutely agree. Another interesting aspect of this scene is that it gives us a good example of something that Shakespeare does quite often. Looking at lines 136 through 139, we have a good example of something called stickomythia, and you see it there. I put it in parentheses for you so you can see how it's spelled. This is a device that Shakespeare learned from reading the Latin drama in grammar school, in which characters exchange quick one-line responses going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. This is fairly common in Shakespeare's plays, and it even occurs again later in this scene in an exchange between Hermia and Helena. And I'll just leave it to you to see if you can locate that example. I want to switch now to Helena. This is a much unhappier situation. I'm going to look at two different scenes here. One from Act 1, lines 226 to 251, and the other scene is scene 1 from Act 2, lines 188 to 244. And in the first of these, Helena is speaking about her love for Demetrius. She talks about how love just doesn't make any damn sense. It's impossible to make someone fall in love with you, and you can't always keep yourself from falling in love, even even when everything around you, everyone around you, and maybe even a voice inside yourself is telling you that this is a bad idea. I shouldn't be doing this. Um, she says one of the passages in that speech that really stuck out to me. She says, "Things base and vile, holding no quantity, love can transpose to form and dignity." So love can make anything look good. Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind, she continues, and therefore is winged Cupid painted blind. We see the effects of this on her in the second scene that I have listed there, and it's really awful. We see the results of her love. She's rejected, cruelly rejected by Demetrius, and she's absolutely humiliated in this scene. In this one of her speeches here, she says, "I am your spaniel, and Demetrius, the more you beat me, I will fawn on you. Use me but as your spaniel. Spurn me, strike me, neglect me, lose me. Only give me leave, unworthy as I am, to follow you." And there's more of it in that scene. So finally, the last scene we're going to talk about on this slide involves not Helena's love for Demetrius, but her friendship with Hermia. She confronts her here in this scene over the perceived betrayal of their friendship because she believes that Demetrius and Lysander and Hermia are all playing some kind of cruel joke on her. So by this point, scene 2 of Act 3, like I said, Lysander and Demetrius, they're in love with Helena. It's not their fault. They are drugged. But she thinks that this is an elaborate prank. And I think it's easy for some readers to rush to judgment about her here. I think it's important to recognize the irony in this scene, that we as an audience or as readers know more than Helena does about what's been going on. She's completely ignorant about the love juice, and there's more that she doesn't know. When Hermia comes on the scene, pleading with Lysander, Helena concludes erroneously, but I think understandably, that Hermia must be in on the game, on the joke. And so Helena gives this heartbreaking speech about their childhood friendship, about how much easier life was before the adult pressures of love and marriage. I think it's just a fantastic speech. Helena says, "Is all forgot, all school days friendship, childhood innocence? We, Hermia, like two artificial gods, have with our needles created both one flower, both on one sampler, sitting on one cushion, both warbling of one song, both in one key, as if our hands, our sides, voices, and minds had been incorporate. So we grew together like to a double cherry, seeming parted, but yet an union in partition. Two lovely berries molded on one stem, so with two seeming bodies, but one heart." Shakespeare critics often point out how often in Shakespeare's plays homosocial bonds, same-sex friendships, are broken or strained to make way for heterosexual unions. This happens in another play of this period, Love's Labour's Lost. Helena and Hermia nearly come to blows by the end of this scene, as each one blames the other for Lysander's and Demetrius's sudden and inexplicable change of affections. By the end of the play, both women are restored to their proper love partners, but we get no sense or don't get the same reassurance about their friendship, which I think is a fascinating aspect of the play. So with the second set of scenes we're going to look at, I'm going to shift the focus more to the themes of imagination and theater and performance. And we're going to start with um, a really fascinating speech right at the beginning of Act 5. And then I tacked on a short scene, lines 207 to 12, short passage a little later. Both of these passages are exchanges between Theseus and Hippolyta, and both of them address the theme of imagination specifically. And I want to read Theseus's speech. They start out here commenting on what Theseus and Hippolyta on what they've been told about the mysterious events of the previous night, which Theseus seizes on as an opportunity to expostulate on the imagination. He doesn't believe that the young lovers, he thinks their imaginations have gotten carried away. He says the imagination is this kind of wild and foolish and misleading faculty that has to be kept in check by reason. So I'll read his speech. I think it's very, very good. I never may believe, he says, these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies, that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the love, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy, or in the night, imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed to bear. But Theseus, later on, he can also be ambivalent about the imagination. During the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, and I'm looking now at lines 207 to 212, he takes note of how even bad acting and crude stagecraft can be a pleasurable stimulus to the imagination. Hippolyta is not impressed by the mechanical's performance. She says, "This is the silliest stuff that ever I heard." And Theseus says, the best in this kind, and by kind he's talking about professional actors, the best actors, the professional ones as opposed to amateurs, are but shadows. And the worst are no worse if imagination amend them. And Hippolyta retorts, she says, well, it must be your imagination then, and not theirs. And Theseus says, if we imagine no worse of them than they of themselves, they may pass for excellent men. Which seems like a really generous remark in response to Hippolyta's fairly severe criticism of the play. We get some elaboration on this topic in another section of Scene 1, lines 61 to 105. This is between the Duke and Philostrate, his master of the revels. And Philostrate, in the section, shares his harsh criticism of the mechanicals. Apparently, the performance has been submitted to him for his approval. He watched it. He thinks it's ridiculous. And he tries to dissuade the Duke from permitting the performance. But Theseus insists, and he tells Philostrate, he says, never anything can be amiss when simpleness and duty tender it, he says. So what he most appreciates about amateur performances, and we learn in this part of the scene that Theseus is quite a playgoer, that he has seen amateur performances performed elsewhere by, he says, scholars. This is certainly an allusion to the kinds of amateur plays that were being performed at the universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, plays that were being performed by the students there. But Theseus says, I appreciate these performances, however inept they are, because they're so earnest. And what he seems to mean is that he admires the intent, that it's the effort to please that matters more than the persuasiveness of the theatrical illusion, which a polished professional troupe could accomplish. So on the one hand, this attitude makes him seem very magnanimous and generous towards the amateur actors, the mechanicals. But on the other hand, and I think more interestingly, it implies that Theseus is uncomfortable with how professional theater can blur the line between fantasy and reality. That he likes the power that comes in laughter, the being able to laugh at the mechanicals, to be able to see through their attempt at dramatic illusion, to see it for what it is, and that this allows him to maintain his own illusions of control, which are very important to him, as we saw in his first speech on the imagination. I wanted to say something about Pyramus and Thisbe. I didn't want to summarize the play. It is a kind of burlesque of Romeo and Juliet, which is fascinating. A Midsummer Night's Dream is often grouped with Romeo and Juliet as one of the sort of lyrical plays of Shakespeare. I decided I would just single out what I think is the funniest little piece of the performance, which, one has to imagine as you're reading it and not seeing it performed on stage. You have to imagine the possibilities of the wordplay in this scene and how a director might choose to stage it. I think one of the critical questions here is, where exactly is Snout's chink? Snout, remember, is playing the wall, and there's a hole in the wall. Where exactly is that hole? It seems that the chink in the wall is between his legs, between his spread legs. So when Bottom says, cursed by thy stones for thus deceiving me, I think we have to picture him then at that point kicking Snout in the testicles and then read the rest of the scene. And if you picture that, then all of a sudden Theseus's response, if you imagine Snout, crumpling to the ground, writhing in pain because Bottom has actually kicked him, Theseus's response is hilarious. And then Flute, who's playing the role of Thisbe, has the line, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." That you can't read those lines with a straight face if the play is performed that way. So the last scene I want to talk about actually involves two pieces, one from Act 4, the very end of Scene 1 of Act 4, lines 190 to 214, which is Bottom talking about his dream, and then Act 5, the very end, which is Puck's epilogue. And I have a lot to say about this. This is an idea that I've been toying with for quite a long time. At the end of Act 4, Scene 1, Bottom awakens. He's been restored to his human form, and he seems not to realize how much time has passed since his assification back in Act 3. At the same time, he vaguely remembers his transformation and the amorous exchanges that he had with Titania and the other fairies, Cobweb and Peace Blossom, and so on. But he remembers them as one might recall images from a dream. And so he says, "I've had a dream past the wit of man to say what dream it was." He's so perplexed by the experience that he wants to share it, and so he has this idea to include it in the play of Pyramus and Thisbe. And he's like, when I get back to Athens, he says, I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom. And I will sing it in the latter end of a play before the Duke. So he clearly intends to perform this. Now, there's no more mention of it, no more mention of the ballad until the end of Act 5, after the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And Bottom, who's been lying on the ground as Pyramus, pretending to be dead, he gets up, the show's over, and after another crude joke about Snout's sore stones, he offers to recite an epilogue to Theseus. And this seems to be the ballad that he referred to in Act 4, Scene 1. But it's worth noting that he no longer calls it a ballad. Instead, he uses the term epilogue, which in the context of Renaissance theater would have been expected to be an address directly to the audience of the play and an appeal to them for their approval, for their applause. The Duke is not interested in hearing the epilogue. He says, "No epilogue, I pray you, for your play needs no excuse." But he does accept the offer of a dance. And this would have been obviously an actual dance performed on stage, which Bottom and Flute, they perform it before the Duke's household. And what I wonder about is when Bottom made the offer to perform the epilogue, if it's plausible that he was holding something, that he was holding a copy of the epilogue in his hands. In earlier scenes, the mechanicals seem to be rehearsing their lines from written scripts, and we know that Quince can write. So if Bottom is holding a copy of the epilogue, maybe it's folded up in his hand, or perhaps he sticks it in a pocket or something, and then drops it on stage during the dance, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential there. There's not enough textual evidence, I absolutely admit, just at the outset here. There's not enough textual evidence to support the insertion of stage directions here, indicating that Bottom is carrying the script of an epilogue. There's nothing to support that. Just for example, there are other bracketed stage directions in this scene. If you look at line 356, for example, right after that line, we're told that Puck enters, and the editors of the Norton Shakespeare put in brackets with a broom. And they did that for us because later on, Puck informs us that he is sweeping the stage. So the bracketed stage direction makes sense there. And there's not enough textual evidence to support a similar insertion saying that Bottom is carrying or holding in his hand a copy of the epilogue. But we know that after the Duke's household retires to bed, that Puck appears on stage sweeping the floor, and he tells us so at lines 375 to 76. He says, "I'm sent with broom before to sweep the dust behind the door." So it is possible then that the audience sees him find the folded epilogue and hold on to it until his final speech. And when we get to the last speech of the play, it's legitimate to ask, if we imagine him finding the epilogue, is it plausible that at this point he unfolds it and reads from it? And then if he does, how much of this speech is actually Bottom's dream? The first line of that last speech, "If we shadows have offended." This echoes Theseus's earlier line about professional actors being shadows. So is this Bottom referring to the performance of the mechanicals, or is it Puck referring to the performance of the entire cast of A Midsummer Night's Dream? It can be read both ways, I think. If one imagined Puck reading Bottom's ballad or epilogue, it might affect how one reads then the transition in Puck's speech at line 417, "And as I am an honest Puck," at which point Puck speaks as himself through to the end of the speech. So one could dismiss this idea, and the play loses absolutely nothing. But staging the scene this way, I think it would be absolutely within the rights of a director to say, this is how I'd like to stage it. Staging the final scene this way would make a really delightful piece of meta theater, a double epilogue, an epilogue within an epilogue. And this is the kind of illusionism and irony that Shakespeare was so good at, and that delights us in so many of Shakespeare's plays. And so with that, I'll bring this presentation on A Midsummer Night's Dream to an end.